In this Ballad of Antara video, we're going to be taking a look at 15 minutes of gameplay that was shown for this just recently. This is a PlayStation 5 action role-playing game that kind of reminds me of a Souls-like. But let's get into kind of a breakdown of what we see in this video so you can kind of like understand some of the mechanics and some of the things we know about this game so far. So the 15-minute gameplay footage showcases the enemies you'll be encountering at the start of the game, as well as two of the playable characters you'll end up controlling. It focuses heavily on the combat aspect of Ballad of Antara, bits of cutscenes, which I think were just used to show off the game's visuals more than anything. So the footage starts off with a cutscene of some guy with a mask carrying a little girl on his back, and it seems like they're exploring some sort of dilapidated structure before a serpent-like dragon pulls up and tries to devour them. Yikes. So the scene then shifts to actual gameplay with what looks like a title card at the start of a chapter, which means the long journey home. I think this is likely the actual start of the game because it has some tutorials popping up a bit, and it seems our objective right now is to go to the bottom of the Colossus, and we are joined by the same little girl we saw in the first cutscene, but this time she's riding a giant cat. After walking a few steps forward, we then get to our first combat segment of the footage where we easily dispatch one enemy. Combat plays out pretty much like you'd expect a Souls-like to play. We have our usual health bar and stamina bar, and it also seems like we have a bar for guarding. If the bar depletes, it'll probably break our guard. We then get to traverse a bit before we encounter another enemy, and wow, our companion just used a fire skill. It seems they'll be assisting us in combat here. After dispatching another enemy, we get to this open area with an enemy who has a gourd for a head, and there are visual cues when enemies do certain attacks. In this case, there's a red indicator when an enemy goes for a heavy attack, which means you can time your parry right and it'll stagger the enemy. We also get to see the skills of the character we're using. It looks like they are flame-based wide arc attacks. We get grabbed at one point by the gourd-headed enemy, and we get an animation we were kind of sucked using its head, which is kind of funny. Combat here can take some time for mini-bosses because they're such damaged sponges, though that's probably because it's still the early game and our equipment probably sucks. Props to the devs for including a mini-boss that could actually kill you during the tutorial section. It seems on the right side of the screen there's a gauge there that builds up as we attack along with a portrait of our character. I'm not quite sure yet what that gauge is for. Anyway, after the mini-boss fight, we get to walk around a bit, going past what looks like human statues in agonizing positions, then triggering a tutorial pop-up asking us to go in the direction these statues are pointing and ring the bell at the end. We then get to walk underneath this one statue where it seems we can press down on the D-pad and ring the bell to reveal a treasure chest. Inside that chest are some coins and a red crystal. After that, we get to go up the stairs and there seems to be some glowing thing on the ground. For some reason, our character walks past that and decides to cross the bridge instead. There seems to be another gourd-headed enemy bowing down like he's worshipping some sort of statue, and we can go past that. I would have loved to see our character assassinate that guy from behind, but we walk past the guy instead. A real shame. Entering the next area immediately triggers a combat sequence against some tiny guy with a straw hat. It seems like we need to rely on skills to really deal significant damage here in the early game because normal attacks do really weak damage against these enemies. I also noticed that the AI for our companions is a bit bad because they pretty much just walk past the enemy and run around before deciding to attack. After that, we get to explore again and the scene suddenly shifts. This time we're inside what looks like an old building with a shrine in the middle, and there's an unnamed female NPC here. We also find that the main character's name is Gassar at this point, and helping the girl up the shrine will trigger a beautiful cutscene where she sits in the middle of the hollow tree shrine and lots of blue flowers start blooming all over the place. The shrine then becomes animated as blue glow envelops the entire area, slowly giving life to what previously looked like a desolate building. Previously ruined columns get restored, and even the landscape outside gets affected with massive tendrils sprouting from the ground as jellyfish-like flying creatures start to show up out of nowhere. Did I say beautiful? I take it back. It looks creepy now. Some statues turn into giant blue flowers, and some creatures that could only be described as mosquito-like unicorns that came from the pits of hell fly by. You heard me. The scene continues as the glow covers the rest of the landscape and spawns a huge dragon at the end. We're not going to fight that thing this early on, are we? Anyway, after the cutscene, we gain control of Gassar, and we get to talk to the female NPC before being allowed to climb some ramps. Based on the pop-up that appears after talking to her, it seems we're now able to switch between Gassar and her. A tutorial pops up and says that switching characters will trigger an attack from the character you are switching to, and I think this is where the gauge on the right side of the screen I mentioned earlier plays a role. When all the gauges are full and the character wheel is blinking, we can trigger a combination attack. After closing the tutorial pop-up, we get to walk past some ghosts stumbling and go outside. As we go outside, we can see the glowing thing on the ground we saw earlier. We can now interact with it and it'll allow us to save. This functions very similarly to the Bonfire system in the Dark Souls series. Using the Bonfire thing allows us to do the following options. Talk to companions, prepare potions, and an option called Soul Resonance. I guess this is where we can allocate attribute points, rest, and then quit. After that, we resume walking and we get to switch to the lady character from earlier. Based on the subtitles, her name is Yunji. I noticed that if you go near certain flowers, you'll be able to pick them up. Probably crafting materials, I'd have a guess. After a bit of a dialogue and walking around, we trigger a scene with the little girl clearing out rubble blocking the way, allowing us to proceed. Instead of proceeding, however, we decide to snipe that freaky mosquito unicorn flying around using Yunji's bow. This obviously triggers a fight sequence where we immediately switch to Gasar and get impaled. I noticed during the fight that while Gasar had fire-based slash attacks, Yunji had ice-based ranged attacks. I guess elemental weakness will be in play here because using ice attacks dealt a really huge chunk of damage against the mosquito unicorn. While walking around and admiring the landscape, since it does look a bit beautiful despite being creepy, we unwittingly trigger another combat sequence, this time with some knight-like enemy with shield. Its shield is a pain to deal with, but at least we get to see what happens when we fully deplete its shield gauge. It kneels down to the ground, vulnerable to attacks, and we can perform a special attack that deals some extra damage to it. After dealing with that monster, we finally get to the area where the resurrected dragon is at. A health bar suddenly shows up, and an enemy, some gigantic guy with a huge cudgel, comes hurling from above and crashes right before you. Talk about a dynamic entry. It's painfully obvious that this is a boss fight since the intense music starts playing as soon as the health bar shows up. Seems this boss is weak against fire damage because Gasar is doing a huge chunk of damage with his fire-based attacks. This boss has two stages, one with the cudgel and the other with his fists. I really don't know why bosses get more aggressive after they lose their weapons. I mean, why would they carry one in the first place if they're stronger without it? Anyways, the boss usually deals attacks that cover a significant amount of area, and the good thing though is that the boss is slow, so once you understand its attack pattern, this boss fight will be a cinch probably. The boss also does this move after it recovers from being staggered where it'll lunge at you, grab you, and slam you to the ground before smacking the love out of you, so we need to be careful with that. After the boss fight, which we don't get to finish because the screen turns black before the final blow hits, we get to see a montage of different landscapes we'll be exploring in the video, as well as a showcase of the many enemies we will come across, which include a two-headed vulture, more gourd heads, a dual-wielding guy with a pointy cap, some plant-like giant, a spear-wielding specter, and a cart with blades attached. It's also showcased some characters who I guess will become playable as the story progresses. These include a burly guy who uses a shield and flail, and some girl that has a staff that functions like a shotgun. The footage ends with some bird landing on some white-haired guy who looks really chill. This guy is probably going to be really important in the story. It's at this point we kind of give our impressions from what we've seen, and I personally think this game looks good. Combat-wise, the game really does play like a typical Souls-like, with defending, dodging, and parrying being extremely crucial. It also has the visual cues you'd expect to find in Souls-like nowadays. The game is for all intents and purposes a Souls-like game after all, and it even has its own bonfire system in the form of a golden plant thing. What I like is how we can switch between characters, each with their own playstyle and elements. It certainly gives you the chance to experiment and find your preferred playstyle. I also like the variety of enemies that we could face. There were a lot of enemies shown in just a 15-minute gameplay video, so this is obviously a positive point. Story-wise, not much was revealed, so I can't really comment on that, although visually the game looks amazing, and I'm not entirely sure if this is an open-world game, but it does show some impressive landscapes. The bad parts of the game are in the combat. Enemies are pretty much sponges with how little damage you deal if you aren't really using skills. Companion combat is also really bad, how the girl only attacks on a whim and pretty much just walks around the entire fight. I only wish we get to see some more customization here in the footage, but maybe we'll get more footage of this closer to the release. This game is slated to release next year, though we aren't exactly sure when. It's a very short video, but I've seen some interesting mechanics that make me want to know more, and I personally think this game is worth looking into if you're a fan of action RPGs and Souls-like games. That's it for our gameplay breakdown of Ballad of Antara. What do you guys think of this one so far? This one's kind of intriguing to me. I think it's definitely one I'm going to keep my eye on. I have no idea if it's going to be good or not, but from what I've seen so far, I like what I see. And obviously, that's enough to keep me interested for now. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.